everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Novel Night. It's our monthly celebration of all things prose. We have this once a month, and every month we celebrate it by featuring some wonderful novelists and also offering 20% off all fiction in the store. You've also come at a perfect time because it's National Poetry Month, so all of our poetry is also 20% off. So you can get some really great deals tonight. We're really honored to have a Deep Vellum published author with us tonight, translator and author, Brice Matthieussent. And without further ado, I will introduce him. Brice is the award-winning translator of over 200 books from English into French, including works by Jack Kerouac, Henry Miller, Bret Easton Ellis, Thomas Pynchon, Jim Harrison, and Charles Bukowski. Matthieussent resides in France, where he teaches the history of contemporary art and aesthetics. Revenge of the Translator, awarded the Prix de style Cultura, is his debut novel and his first to appear in English. He is also the author of the novels Good Vibrations and Luxuosa, all published by P.O.L.
Yeah, that's true, but I published all the novels too. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Great. Hello, everybody. Hello. You must forgive my English. I'm a little tired. I'm making a book tour throughout the States, especially Texas for the moment. But after that, I go to Pittsburgh and I go to Boston and so on. And back to France. I'm French, as you know. I brought the book in the French edition, Vengeance du traducteur. Some of you speak French? Do you speak French? Ah, bon. Très bien. It was published by P.O.L, which is a very good publishing house in France. And I am very happy of the publication of this, my translation, not my translation, you know, slip on the tongue, of the translation of my book by somebody else. It's the first time, no, it's not the first time. It's the second time I was translated because my book was already translated to Italian. It's published in Italian. Okay. So the best thing maybe is to show you what it looks like. Now, my idea as a vengeance, as a revenge, my idea as a revenge, it was the idea of the novel, was to consider the page as a battleground. A battleground, okay? It's not so often that a novelist considers that the form itself of the book is very important to the story he wants to tell. And my idea was to put my text, it's not my text, it's a text written by my main character, who is called trad, like traduction, trad, like translation, okay, in French, traduction, traducteur. And it's his text at the bottom of the page, and at the top of the page, it's blank, and it's the place of the author. So my idea was to introduce a fictional translator who operated a revenge, very radical revenge. He was deleting the text he was translating, okay? So, because for many reasons, I can explain these reasons. He dislikes a lot the text he translates, and he's furious about the way he's treated by the writer, by the author. And so he prefers to delete the text of the author and to replace the text of the author by some notes he is writing himself. And some of the notes are, of course, some stories, some pages from the author, which he changes, he modifies, he sometimes deletes entirely, he deletes whole chapters of the story he's supposed to translate. So he's a very bad translator, okay? You understood that. He's the awful translator, the worst nightmarish translator for an author. And he does that because he has a secret hope and a secret desire to become an author. And the story of the book, in its form, in its visual form, is to tell this desire of Trad, who at the beginning is a translator, okay, So I can show you some other pages. He is a translator, but he leaves only the little asterisk here, which in Texas I call this the Lone Star. It's really a lone star. And you know what it's for? It's for calling a note. And usually it's a note of the translator, which happens very rarely. In any case, I think I don't like to put notes of the translator's notes. When I translate a book, I try to put the meaning of the note, to include it into the text itself, usually when I translate, because I still translate. So now I both write and translate. But he just keeps this asterisk, and he puts the thin black line, the thin black bar, which separates the two spaces of the page, okay? And he writes a note which sometimes has nothing to do with the text he's writing, because he's very talkative. Trad is very talkative. He wants, and it's really a question of place, he wants of space. He wants to take as much space as possible. And that's why at the beginning I put a quotation of Kafka in his letter to his father. And he said, well, I'm going to read the translation of my translator. I, who am not even the pawn of a pawn in the great chess game, far from it, now want to take the place of the queen. I, the pawn of a pawn, a piece which doesn't even exist, which isn't even in the game, and next I may want to take the king's place as well, or even the whole board. So it's a story of my translator, you understand, of course. And at the same time, as it was my first novel, it's my story. Because when I was writing this book, I had already translated about 150 American novels. Not only English novels, but only American novels. And I can tell you why later. I had translated, Henry Miller, Jack Kerouac, Charles Bukowski, Bret Easton Ellis, and many others. Not Thomas Pynchon yet, not yet. But it came later. And my idea was to find a way of writing my first novel. And I thought that the simplest way of writing my first novel was to introduce an activity, maybe a trade, that I knew quite well, which is the trade of translation, and to invent a character which is underemployed in the novelist world, in the world of the novels, for centuries and worldwide, which is the translator. Translator as character of a novel. I thought it was a good idea. I knew that Vladimir Nabokov had used a translator at the end of one of his novels, The Defense Lugin, and Italo Calvino, the Italian novelist, had already also used one translator in one of his novels, and I knew, of course, that it was all, nearly all. So I thought that I didn't want doctors, I didn't want traders, I didn't want truck drivers, I didn't want fathers of numerous family with many children. I just wanted to see what it would be like to write a novel and to choose to have a translator as his main character, maybe his hero. And the story would be, for me, evidently, this translator is going to become a writer. So I inscribe myself in a long tradition of writers who tell the story of a nobody becoming a writer. If you take In Search of Lost Time by Proust, for instance, it's exactly this story. If you take many novels And I was thinking of John Fante. Maybe you know John Fante.
I know John.
You know John Fante? Great. And the story of John Fante's novels is very often how nobody dreams of becoming a writer, and suddenly is published by a magazine of the East Coast and believes in the work he's doing, in the writing he's doing in his small room while he's working in factories in Los Angeles. So my story, in a way, a translator becomes a writer, is a I mean, very frequently narrated story in literature, because it's the story of every writer. Before becoming a writer, you're not a writer. And it was my way of becoming a writer. For since then, I have published 6 novels. Okay, this is my first. It was published in France in 2009, yeah, and published last year in the States. So I was wondering how, in a visible way, I was going to manifest that my translator, who is still writing notes under the thin black bar, I was wondering how visibly, in a visible way, he was going to become a writer. My idea, and it's an idea that I kept for months, even for years, I was sure, I believed in this idea. I believed in the idea that the translator will accumulate lines below this bar and push up the line until it goes on top of page, and the line one day, I don't know how, I didn't know how it was going to happen, but one day this line is going to disappear, was going to disappear. And so the translator, in his small rectangle, in his small space, not so small here, okay, this here not so small, would become the writer. And I can show you how it happens in the book. Here he's still a translator, okay? The bar is here, the absent text is here, but I must show you this. Yes. The bar is under, and the small star is under, and the translator has taken the place of the writer, okay? And his problem is to get rid of this little thing at the bottom of the page, and to get rid of this. And I won't tell you how he manages to do it, but he manages. Little by little, here, no asterisk, no long star at the bottom of the page, okay? And here, the bar has disappeared. And so suddenly, in the page, as you can see it, without reading it, but you can see that the translator, and it's exactly what it is about in the text, the translator becomes a real writer. And all the end of the text is like that, okay? Now I can even show you, I can even read you briefly how it happens, how he does this. He's writing over on the top, in the top part of the page. And this is his efforts to cling where he is, because he's not sure he's going to last in this space. I cling on. I believe in my lucky star. The lucky star, of course, is the little asterisk. I hold on tight. I am still here, even if I can hardly believe it. So he's wondering how it's possible to stay so high on the page, but he manages. And I must tell you now how trad, because it's always the story of trad, is mixing himself with other characters. Because for a long time I had this idea, as I told you, of the text which was going to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, like a sea which is coming and invading the page, and until the moment when the text was going to go as far up as to explain why Trad, the translator, is now a writer. What I must explain to you is that Trad, of course, is translating a book. Trad is a French translator of an American novel. And in this novel, you have 2 or 3 characters. This novel, inside this Revenge of the Translator, talks about an American translator, so the symmetrical position of Trad, an young American translator called David Gray, who translates the book of a French novelist living in Paris. Okay, so it's a symmetrical situation of Trad. Okay. And the problem which David Gray has with his French writer is called Abel Prot. The problem he has is that Abel Prot has written a book which takes place in Paris, and Abel Prot wants the translation, the American translation of his book, to take place in New York.
Yeah.
So, it happened to me once in my career as a translator, okay? I met an author who had written a spy novel taking place in London, and the book was bought by a French publisher, and I had lunch with this author, American author in fact, in Paris, and he told me, Brice, it would be great if the novel could take place in Paris. So please change all the geography of the city. Please change all the names of the streets and the boulevards. Change all the newspapers. Change all the habits of having tea at 5 or anything. And you drink more Ricard or pastis or anything you want, but no English way of life. So I told him, well, it's going to be very difficult what you ask me, you know. It's not called translation, this. It's not called translation. It's called adaptation, rewriting, and maybe it could even be called the writing of a new novel, but you must do it. I'm not going to do it on your behalf. You must do it if you want to write another novel, but I won't do that. So he said, well, I want the plot and I want the novel to take place in Paris anyway. So I phoned my publisher, and my publisher phoned the American author, and everything went cool, more cooler. And the American author accepted that the translation, as it used, well, it was supposed to be, the translation of the book took place in London, finally. So I remembered this story which happened to me, and it was not a very pleasant story. And I put in my book, in The Revenge of the Translator, Abel Prot, this French author, who is a very nasty guy, a very bad guy, vain, arrogant, full of despise for his translator, his American translator. He asks David Gray that his novel will take place in New York and not in Paris. Okay. So the idea of a fight between the author and the translator is not only on the page here, but it is in the story itself. Okay? So I wanted to have a place for the translator, under, below, and over was a place of the writer. But the place of the writer is empty. Okay? And it's like you know, piedestal of a statue, but the statue is gone. You see that? It looks like that. You know, you have this piedestal. You say piedestal? Pedestal. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Pedestal. In French, we say piedestal, and the word comes from French, of course. Pedestal. Okay. It looks like that. I thought about it because the statue has disappeared. Okay. And so it's a little like I thought about the statue of the father. Because the text I am translating, when I translate the text, it's like the father text, okay? And I write a text which derives from the father text. But in my book, and that is the revenge, that is one of the revenges. The father text or the father's statue or the text of the author has disappeared. That's the first revenge, okay? And the other revenge is that Trad, as I told you, at the beginning of the text, he's so furious about the text he translates that he erases, he deletes many chapters. Not only sentences, not only small words sometimes. No, whole chapters. He's an awful translator. Terrible. You can't trust him to translate anything. And he is very talkative, as I told you. So he wants to fill up this space as much as he can. So to fill up this space, he sometimes rewrites, copies the text he has deleted. So the reader, you and me, or especially you as I am the writer of this book, the reader has some notion of the plot. And the plot is a story of David Gray with, I don't know how to say that, his French author, Abel Prot. Okay? So the story appears in fragments, in small spaces, and we have some notions of what's happening in the novel. In the novel, I have never read, of course, and in the novel nobody will ever read. The novel, which should have appeared on top of page, has disappeared. You only have some fragments of this novel on bottom page. To give you some examples, Trad sometimes erases all the adverbs of one chapter. But when he erases all the adverbs, he takes the list, he copies the list of all the adverbs on the bottom of the page. So you have a notion of what happens on top through the list of the adverbs. And sometimes it's only the verbs, sometimes it's only the nouns, sometimes it's only the adjectives. But he takes notes of all the damages he commits to the text, which has disappeared, of course. And what happens in the book is that by a kind of trick which is possible in fiction but not in real life, Trad meets his characters, the characters of the novel, which are David Gray and Abel Prot, and the secretary of Abel Prot, who is Doris Knight, who becomes the mistress of David Gray. Okay, this is a simple story. Everybody has already read this kind of story. Okay. But something which is a little more unconventional is that when you are translating a book, you're not supposed to meet the characters in real life, the characters of the book you are translating, okay? Because the characters of the book are supposed, they believe strongly that they live in a world which they possess, in which they are not the creations of somebody else who is a writer or a translator. In my book, this happens. That is to say that Trad drinks a beer at one moment in New York with David Gray. And David Gray, I repeat to you if you haven't understood, and I confess it's a little complicated. David Gray is a character in the novel that Trad translates. Okay? So I imagine that the translator, who is an author, or nearly an author, okay, meets in real life. When I say real life, it's the life of the book, right? It's not here. He meets one of his characters, and he has his computer with him, and he says it's on chapter, I don't know, I would say it's on chapter 14, okay? And on chapter 14, he meets David Gray in a bar in New York. They have a beer together, and Trad tells David Gray that he is translating a book in which David Gray is just a character, okay? And to prove it, because David Gray says, "You crazy man, I don't believe you, what you have taught me, what you're telling me, it's impossible. It never happens. It will never happen." Okay, and Trad takes his computer and goes on chapter 14, which tells the story of these two people having a beer in a New York bar, okay? And he raises a sentence where they both drink a beer, and suddenly the two glasses of beer disappear from the table. So it's a proof of the power of trad, the power of the translator becoming author, on the reality of, on a certain type of reality, okay? Do you follow me? Yeah, great. I'm not too confusing, I hope. Okay. And at the end of the book, it's Trad, who is a nice guy. He's a nice guy. He doesn't take advantage of his situation. For instance, he doesn't reveal to David Gray and to Doris Knight, you remember Doris Knight is the mistress, the girlfriend of David Gray, and they become friends. He doesn't reveal the other chapters of the book. He doesn't reveal to these two characters their future. And the idea is that maybe we are, I wrote something about that, I don't know, it was on the page. And maybe we are footnotes, we are only footnotes in the writings of an author. And maybe the writings of this author are only footnotes in the writing of another author, and so on, like Russian dolls. Okay? And the idea of Russian dolls was present in my mind. La mise en abîme. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can tell you that. It's the beginning of chapter 6. I can't remember who wrote that all human life, yours, mine, is perhaps only a series of footnotes to a vast, obscure, and unfinished masterpiece. In that version of reality, we would be minor appendices of a great unknown novel whose author will never reveal himself. This invisible author would whisper our replies, decide our actions, our loves, our careers, our thoughts. For him, everything would be clear, unless he too is but a pawn of another novel, more expensive than the first, written by another author, a writer who is twice as powerful, who might be in his turn the brief note of another author, etc., etc., etc. You could imagine that, yeah. And I imagine this thing just on 2 levels in my book, just on 2 levels. It was enough. I didn't want to develop too many things. But the idea was that really the translator, who is limited to this small space, was going to take more space than at the beginning and to occupy the whole space, the whole page, and become the author of a book. And he becomes the author of a book, which is this book. And suddenly I had this surprise at this time to be translated into American, which caused me great vertigo. Because my book talks about translations from American to French, and inside this translation there is the story of another translation from French to American, and suddenly my own book is translated into American. And so I thought that maybe I was obliged to rewrite completely the book, because something very strange was happening. It, in a way, added another floor to the rocket. Can I say that? You understand? Okay.
Yeah.
I was too lazy to do it. I should have done it. It has been translated into Italian, but there is no story, there is no link in this book between the author and the processes of the transport of text with Italian. So in Italian, it's exactly the same. There is one difference in the American version. At the end, Trad has finished his book, and his book is totally independent of the translation of the book he was supposed to translate, okay? Because he invented, he erased so many things that it doesn't look like the book he was supposed to translate. So he wrote his own book, which is called Translator's Revenge. Okay. So, Translator's Revenge is published in French, La Vengeance du Traducteur, in French, by a French publisher. And this book is bought by an American publisher who wants to have it translated. And it's exactly the story of my book becoming this one. Okay. So at the end of the book, Trad is in his Parisian flat and he has an appointment with his translator, American translator. And in the French version, my American translator is called Mike Kirkfeld. Okay, it's a friend of mine. So I had already this kind of link between real life and fiction. But when I met Emma Ramadan, who is my translator, and wonderful translator, she didn't erase, she didn't add. Okay, I was a little nervous about what she could do with this book. Okay?
Take her revenge.
Take her revenge. I don't know on what, but that's exactly how it ends. Have you read the book?
No.
No. Okay, so Trad has this appointment with his translator, and in the French version, it's a man called Mike Kirkfeld. Okay, and in the American, I talked when I met Emma Ramadan 2 years ago. We talked a lot about the translation problems here. And I told her, Emma, I must change Michael Kirkfeld, and instead of Michael Kirkfeld, put Emma Ramadan. So the end of the book reads like that. This Emma, and Trad is speaking. Trad is waiting to meet her in his flat. Talk about the translation of Vengeance du Traducteur. This Emma Ramadan seems nice, enthusiastic, zealous, and nice. She wrote to me that she really likes my novel. She's even translated a few pages already. Trad is speaking, not me. Okay? Don't misunderstand. Don't mix everybody with everybody. She wrote to me that she really likes my novel. She's even translated a few pages already. I truly hope that it's not David Gray using a fake name, because they are enemies now. Okay. In addition to this rather understandable apprehension, I harbor another, more insidious fear. That this Emma Ramadan will be like me, but she will not remain humble, enthusiastic, and zealous, modest and rigorous, as a translator must be. That she will take herself for Zorro, you know, the masked avenger, Zorro, the masked avenger, or for a vampire, or heaven forbid that she take herself for a writer. I get up to open the door, I fear the worst. That's what Trad says. And suddenly, like an image in the mirror, that's what I feared too. When I met Emma Ramadan, I didn't know her, and I didn't know how she was going to translate my book. Maybe she was going to reinterpret, to rewrite everything, to make a whole new book. And I feared really that she wanted to write her first novel, like the story of Trad in this book, which is a temptation maybe of some translators. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have questions, I'm ready to answer them.
It's like marching on quicksand. You lose track of who you are. I'm reminded of something that Douglas Hofstadter once wrote. He said, this sentence spent 3 years in Hungarian before being retranslated back into English.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I think it's a book, it's not only a book about, it's not an essay on, it's not an essay. It's a novel, definitely. When I wrote it, I was much influenced by Vladimir Nabokov. Okay, even to the point that Lolita appears in the book, but Lolita, after Vladimir Nabokov has left her, you know, at the end of Lolita, when she becomes married to a football player, an American football player, and she's not seducing anymore, okay? And she comes to Paris and she becomes the mistress of Abel Prout's father. Well, it was a way to signify my admiration for Vladimir Nabokov. The idea of the book is, at the same time, it can seem a little complex, okay? A little complex, that's what I was told sometimes. It's a play of mirrors, who is translating who, and how does everybody translate the text he has to translate. Does he do it faithfully, trying to be faithful to the original, not to add anything, not to delete anything, which is really impossible to do. When you translate it, totally impossible. But at least you don't delete whole chapters. You don't add characters. You don't delete, I don't know, scenes, landscapes, minor characters. Usually a translator never does that, never. So it was, the idea was about trying to show how a translator, how through a kind of maybe delirium or transgressing the rules, because writing can be transgressing the rules, or trying to find another language for things which have never been done, or for things which were never expressed. And then from this position of the translator, how could a translator become a writer? In my book, it's through many deadly sins to the deontology of the translator.
Let me ask, I remember the Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes was once asked, you know, you speak perfect English,
Yeah.
why don't you translate your own novels? And
Yeah.
he says, well, in the time I would spend translating the novel, I could write another novel.
I can read another novel.
I could write another.
I can write.
In other
Yeah,
words,
exactly.
the question assumed that it was very easy just to rip off a translation, just dash it off kind
Yeah,
of thing. But
no.
in your experience, it probably, let me ask you, is translating a novel as difficult for you as writing your own novel?
No. I think that it's very different. I think that translators are in some ways writers because they are the authors. You see, she has exactly the same type as me. I've never seen a book like that in my whole life. Not in France, no, not in the States, nowhere. Not even in Russia or in Japan, I guess. Sometimes, usually, the name of the translator doesn't appear on the cover. It appears sometimes on the fourth cover, what we call in France a fourth cover, okay? But usually it appears only here. And curiously here, in this book, it doesn't appear on this page. I don't know why, maybe it's a mistake. Maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, it appears here. So, I think that the relationships of I've had many different kinds of relationships between authors I was translating and me. So it was sometimes very friendly, very, how could I say, productive, and the author solved very easily or not so easily the problems I was showing him or her. And sometimes it was a very difficult situation, very difficult relationship. Sometimes, as I told you, the author wanted to rewrite totally the book, and it's not exactly what is supposed to be the role of the author when you are translating his book. Not at all. So, and I think that translating is, of course, a way of writing, but writing a new text, I don't know exactly how the reader can believe that when he reads Thomas Bernard or Carlos Fuentes or any French novelist, how he can believe that he reads exactly what the writer has written. It's a big question because I don't believe that the two texts are equivalent. These two texts are totally different in my way.
Traitore, right?
Hmm? No, she's not a traitor. No. She did her best, definitely. She did her best. But it's a big difference because my text comes from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and this one is here. It's not the same context. It doesn't, the words don't mean the same things. Connotations are entirely different. So it's a problem for every translation. I mean, Shakespeare never wrote in French. Dostoevsky never wrote in English. And when you read Dostoevsky in English, you read something which looks like Dostoevsky, but which is not Dostoevsky. If you really want to understand what Dostoevsky says, you must learn Russian, I think. And so I think that your question was also why I didn't translate it myself. Because my mother tongue is French, and Emma Ramadan's mother tongue is English, which is not evident when you read her name, because Emma always makes me think of Emma Bovary, Madame Bovary. And Ramadan is a Lebanese second name, and there is nothing English in this name, and I love it. Yeah. Yes?
Did you expect or want it to be translated?
Oh, it was a great dream I had for my book, yeah. I always told myself, if Vengeance du Traducteur is translated one day, I want it to be in English. And when it was translated in Italian, I was very happy, but not as much as when I learned that it was being translated in English by Deep Vellum, which is a publishing house from Dallas, and which publishes till now only translations. And I said, bravo, really. So they were very fond. I mean, the manager, Will Evans, was very fond of this book because it talks about translation. And as he is a specialist of Russian literature, he loved the idea of Russian dolls, and I don't know what else. I've forgotten. But he loved the idea of this book talking about translations and the act of translation. I have a few pages inside on how I consider that when I translate, and I promise you I do it as best as I can, and it's the same situation for anybody from any language to any language, you lose so many things. A friend of mine tells that you lose nearly 40–50%, and you add about 40 and 50%. Not that you delete chapters, no, you do the best you can. Even in poetry, when you translate poetry or essays, it's not as catastrophical as when you translate fiction. Then you lose about 40 or 50%, and you add the equivalent in your language of connotations. Yes. Yes.
What I was thinking is, if this was being re-edited, which I wish for you, that they re-edited.
You mean in French?
No,
or in English? In English, yeah.
When they do it in English, I mean, when it's French, it was written in French, so fine. But when it's in English, another level would be to be a bilingual text, which I love reading bilingual texts for those languages that I know, because I love comparing. Like I was picking up a poetry book there, and I love that the Spanish is here and the French is here. Those books are wonderful. So it would be an extra level of having, but of course it becomes some,
I mean, bilingual books usually are poetry. I've never seen, I think, except for very sophisticated publishings. Novels, bilingual novels. It exists in France sometimes. You have some, of course. Of course, I know that.
I know you do. I know you do.
Yeah, but I don't think
and I love them.
Yeah, but usually it's for classics. And my book is not yet a classic.
No, but
so
it's a book about translation.
It's a book about translation.
That would be an extra twist.
Yeah,
an extra
you're right.
twist.
You're right. One thing which is curious, Emma Ramadan managed not to put one translator's note in the book.
Awesome.
Because it's only translator's note, okay? But she could have put, well,
2 stars.
yeah, but
She would have done.
sometimes
2
there is a
stars,
note
3
in the
stars.
note, in the note, in the
Right.
note, okay? So 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars. Some pages I don't know, I don't remember where.
Yeah.
No. Here, for instance, there are 2.
Oh.
It's not a lone star, it's 2 stars. Okay.
So that's not Emma?
Sorry?
That's not
The
Emma.
2 stars.
No, that's not Emma, that's me. That's me. And when she writes translators, it's not translators' notes, because in my text, it's, in French we say note du traducteur, so NDT, okay? But I made some plays upon the words, many plays upon the words. Any word, for instance, you have nausea of the translator, instead, not nausée du traducteur. Nausée du traducteur, nausea, it makes N, the N is here, okay, so it's okay for me. Some instance you have, alors, that's one thing that I told Emma, feel creative, feel free to adapt whatever invention you could to this little text, you know, at the end of the passages, at the end of the paragraphs. And she invented wonderful things. For instance, but it was very difficult. I give you an example. For instance, you've understood that Trad hates the text he is translating, and so he destroys it. And at the end of one of his notes, I wrote N du traducteur, not N, the capital N, but for the people who speak French, but I guess it's only you, la haine, hatred. Hatred, and it's pronounced exactly the same way as N, the N, capital N, okay? So it's untranslatable, this. And she invented many beautiful ways of inserting herself in a way, but being faithful to the spirit of what I wanted to mean in these little things. For instance, here you have translators quote. Here you just have TN. And there are some, yeah, trajectory north, TN. Okay. Some are more funny. Ah, yeah, I love this one. Translators, no. Because Trad says, fundamentally, he says no. No way. I'll never again be a faithful translator. That's what he says. Toiler's nausea. Toiler's nausea. Delirium's mainspring. Trickster's nook. Trickster's nook. I like this one. Here you have also double star. Yeah, one thing, I like this one. Tarzan's nosedive. Tarzan's nosedive. The jump of Tarzan, you know, this leap, which I imagine above the Atlantic Ocean, from New York to Paris or from Paris to New York, and which for me was a good metaphor of translation. Because everybody who reads a book in translation thinks that, look, it's very easily done, and you have the result here, and it's faithful, of course, to the original, and it's the book. I think publishers love to have their readers believe that the book they are buying was written exactly like that by the author, and that there is no translation, no translator. The translator is somebody who gets between, and it's awkward situation, between the author and the reader. And so I believe that the work of the translator is not only to look meanings of the words in dictionaries, because I think that dictionaries, they don't lie really, but they lie. I mean, bread in English is not pain en français, in French. The connotations of the word are so different that you have no other choice but translating bread by pain. But you must be very conscious that the connotations of the two words are totally different. For instance, car or space doesn't mean the same thing in English as in French, voiture and espace. The words don't have the same past, the same historical, the same history and the same inscription in the subconscious of the reader. An American reader has not the same references as a French reader. And it's true for all countries, all languages. And yeah, it's a good thing that globalization has not destroyed yet these differences, and that there are still different languages with different ways of living, different cultures, and translation can bring to readers some views of these different cultures and these different literatures. Yeah. Yes.
Don't you think there might be some advantage, though, to translations? Now, you mentioned Proust, for example. My guess is no one has dared to try to update Proust, whereas we get a new translation every generation. We've had 5 or 6 translations to try to put it in context and take those associations in context. So in a way, we're maybe getting a more accurate picture of what Proust said in his time by reading the current translation by someone who's really studied the French culture at the time.
Maybe, that's possible, but at the same time, a new translation occurs in a period which is far further from the time when Proust wrote his famous book. So a new translation supposes that what we say in France is that every generation must have the new translation of the masterpieces, okay? So everything is retranslated between 30 and 60 years, let's say. But as time passes, the distance from the time when the book was published and read for the first time, is bigger. This distance is bigger. So maybe the language is more accurate to the period when it is done, but the gap of time gets bigger and bigger. So, I don't know. I retranslated Walden by Thoreau.
I mean, your book will have to be retranslated in another 100 years, maybe.
Thanks. Yeah, if my book is not forgotten.
Yeah, but it's like I'm thinking of Baroque music. The more we go, the further away we are from Baroque music, but the way closer to Baroque music, and the way it was done in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So some translations look very dated because they actually are very marked with the time when they were translated.
I agree with you. Yeah.
So
I agree with you. But it's very complicated because if you want to translate, I don't know, Don Quixote into Old English, nobody will read it, nobody will understand it. So the problem is that if you translate Don Quixote or things like books like that, or poets, medieval poets, or Elizabethan playwrights, not into English, of course, but into French, in this example. The problem is to modernize, of course, the language, but not to put a language, to use a language which is too typical of the period you are doing your job, you're translating.
Right.
Otherwise, the translation is going to be old-fashioned in 10 years.
Yeah.
So you must find an equilibrium between not being too inscribed in contemporary language and at the same time to propose something which is modern. Maybe it's a word, I don't know.
That's where you use the footnotes to explain the context for the new readers.
One thing I discovered is that first, what my novels, which I write, have nothing to do with my translations, and I discovered this, and I was very surprised, because I thought that I was going to write novels influenced by what I had translated. I thought it was very possible that maybe it should even happen, but it never happened. It never happened. I was very surprised. For instance, I'm a little famous in France for having translated big sky novelists, big country novelists, like Jim Harrison, Thomas McGuane, Rick Bass, people who love big sky country and so on. And my books are quite claustrophobic, okay? And this is the space where I live, in the footnote. And the second thing is that when I translate, when I am not a writer, but when I translate, I never make footnotes. Never.
You have introductions?
Sorry?
You have introductions?
Introductions? I write introductions sometimes, yeah. Postface, you say that? Postface? A text after the book. After the, how do you call that? Afterward, you're right. Afterward, thanks. Other questions?
What was your working relationship like with Emma? Were you sort of heavily involved as she worked on the text, or were you more hands-off?
Who?
With
Emma.
Emma Ramadan?
I was very surprised. We had this lunch I talked to you about in south of France, in Arles, a small city close to Marseille. I live in Marseille. And we had this lunch and we talked about, first, as I told you, Emma, your name must be at the end of the book. So another time it's a strange mixture between real life and fiction. I think it's the only occurrence in world literature where the name of the translator appears in the fiction. I've never heard. If somebody can tell me another example, I'd be glad to learn it. And we talked about this problem of the small words, translator's note to traducteur, how she was going to manage. And for the whole book, I just told her, feel creative, feel free, but be faithful. Please be faithful. Yeah, don't invent too much. Be faithful to my text, but be creative. And I was very surprised because we exchanged our mails, our email address, and so on. I never received an email from Emma during her translation. I thought she was good. Yes, once or twice. No, once or twice. I thought that she was going to have many problems to translate the book, but she solved them without my help. So, congratulations to Emma. Yeah.
And then you love the translation.
I love the translation, yeah. Yeah. It's faithful to what I wanted, yeah. So you can read it in English. It's quite close to the French version, as far as it's possible to be close.
So would you say then that the original is faithful to the translation?
To know that, what I should do is translate Emma's book into French
We will
again.
implode.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you to you. Thanks for your questions. You have other ones? No?
All right, we're going to move over here to do a signing. So
Yeah.
and thank you so
I can
much.
sign some. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.